Forensic artists have reconstructed ancient human faces using just skull structure and tissue data. The results usually take people by surprise. These faces do not look like hideous cave monsters, but rather like ordinary people you could pass on the street. This raises a genuinely more complex and scientifically fascinating question. Were ancient humans actually attractive by any standard? Or have we pictured this entirely wrong? Let's untangle this properly, because the honest answer requires separating two genuinely different questions. Let's start with the modern illusion, because the image we have collectively built of our distant ancestors is almost entirely wrong. For decades, pop culture has aggressively pushed a very specific caricature. We are conditioned to picture hunched, excessively hairy, savage creatures lumbering through the Ice Age, barely recognizable as human. This depiction is not just a slight exaggeration, it is a fundamental misunderstanding of hominin anatomy. If you were to somehow transport one of these ancient individuals into the present day, give them a shower, and put them in modern clothing, they would not look like a movie monster. They would just look like a completely normal person. We know this not through wild speculation, but through meticulous forensic reconstruction. Take, for example, the recent three-dimensional facial reconstruction of a Neanderthal woman known as Shanidar Z, who lived roughly 75,000 years ago. When experts took her flattened skull and carefully rebuilt the soft tissue, muscle layers, and skin, the face that stared back at them was enormously revealing and completely shattered our rigid prehistoric assumptions. It was profoundly human. Her features were remarkably soft and entirely relatable. She did not possess the exaggerated, brutish visage we often assume. In fact, if she were to walk past you on a busy city street in London or New York today, blending into the crowd on a Tuesday morning, she would barely warrant a second glance. This is a genuinely fascinating and profoundly important realization that changes everything. It forces us to completely discard the cartoonish caveman stereotype and confront a much more nuanced physical reality. The underlying bone structure of our ancestors, while occasionally more robust or slightly different in proportion, supported facial features that fall well within the normal spectrum of human variation we see right now. They had expressive eyes, familiar jawlines, and the same fundamental physiological architecture that we do. We have allowed the sheer vastness of time to trick our brains into assuming that ancient automatically means alien. But the biological distance between us and them, specifically regarding basic facial aesthetics, is shockingly narrow. Recognizing this physical familiarity is just the first step. It thoroughly proves that ancient humans were not visually repulsive by default, but it does not fully explain the actual mechanics of what genuinely draws two individuals together in the harsh conditions of the prehistoric world. If their faces were fundamentally similar to ours, then the rules governing attraction must also share a deeper, considerably older connection. There is something else at play entirely. Spoiler: the definitive answer to how human attraction operated back then does not simply lie in the flesh, but in something considerably more complex and deeply programmed. Now, let's bring up the underlying mechanics of what we actually mean when we call a face beautiful, because this is where the science gets genuinely fascinating. We tend to incorrectly assume that our modern preferences are entirely shaped by contemporary culture, superficial magazines, or the highly specific aesthetics currently trending online. But think carefully about what actually happens when you are mindlessly swiping through various profiles on a dating app today. You might look at a photo for a mere fraction of a second before deciding exactly which way to swipe. During that brief moment, you are completely convinced that you are just casually evaluating their personal vibe, their hairstyle, or their unique fashion sense. In reality, your brain is quietly doing something considerably older and far more computationally complex behind the scenes. Beneath the surface of that instantaneous, seemingly shallow judgment, your subconscious mind is essentially running a highly sophisticated, prehistoric diagnostic scan. It is actively searching for very specific biological markers that have not changed in tens of thousands of years. In the rigorous field of evolutionary biology, researchers have extensively documented that one of the most universally recognized markers of true physical attractiveness is facial symmetry. This is not simply some arbitrary artistic standard that ancient societies somehow randomly agreed upon. Symmetrical facial features serve as what dedicated scientists technically call an honest signal. An honest signal is essentially a powerful biological advertisement that cannot be easily faked by the individual. Developing a perfectly symmetrical face is actually an enormously difficult and demanding physiological task for any living creature. It strictly requires a growing organism to execute its complex genetic blueprint flawlessly while successfully navigating a remarkably hostile environment. If an ancient human possessed a highly symmetrical face, they were effectively walking, breathing proof of their exceptional underlying genetic resilience. It clearly demonstrated that they had successfully survived the intense, unforgiving evolutionary pressures of early physical development. Specifically, this striking symmetry acted as a reliable broadcast, signaling that they possessed an incredibly robust immune system capable of fighting off a heavy parasite load. Furthermore, it proved that they had consistently avoided any severe malnutrition during their most critical and profoundly vulnerable childhood years. When our distant ancestors looked closely at each other, they were absolutely not analyzing bone structure with a conscious, refined appreciation for modern artistic beauty. Instead, they were instinctively reading these exact same honest signals of enduring health, optimal fertility, and extraordinary developmental stability. The individual standing there with the highly symmetrical, perfectly proportioned face was visually communicating their undeniable physiological competence to survive in a tremendously harsh landscape. Our brains gradually evolved to directly reward the accurate detection of that specific biological competence with the deeply powerful, intoxicating sensation that we currently categorize as physical attraction. We are quite literally, mathematically programmed to find the visual evidence of a strong immune system irresistibly beautiful. So, when we seriously ask if ancient humans were actually attractive, we must recognize a fundamental truth. The neurological hardware responsible for defining attractiveness was forged entirely within their world. They were not merely subject to these profound biological rules. They are the absolute reason those rules exist today. Whenever you swipe right, you utilize their survival mechanism. Now, we must address something genuinely more complicated about this. But here is the genuinely important point worth sitting down to address directly, because this is where the conversation regarding physical attraction becomes infinitely more complex than a simple yes or no. We have clearly established that early humans possessed the underlying biological hardware to meticulously recognize facial symmetry and physical health as beautifully honest signals of superior genetic fitness within their own specific, intimately connected social groups. However, the true test of prehistoric attractiveness requires us to completely expand our perspective and look at what happened when entirely different hominin species crossed paths. Imagine the profound reality of our direct ancestors, Homo sapiens, expanding across the prehistoric landscape and eventually encountering the Neanderthals. For a very long time, the prevailing assumption in both popular culture and early academic circles was that these two groups would have viewed each other with absolute disgust. We assumed that the noticeable physical differences, such as the heavier brow ridges, the distinct cranial shapes, and the uniquely robust skeletal structures, would have formed an insurmountable aesthetic barrier. We stubbornly projected our own modern, highly rigid prejudices regarding conventional beauty onto a profoundly distant past, utterly convinced that such wildly divergent physical traits would immediately and permanently negate any lingering possibility of deep, mutual attraction ever blossoming between them. Yet, the biological reality of what actually occurred during those ancient encounters provides a truly mind-blowing twist that shatters every preconceived notion we hold about prehistoric physical standards. The definitive answer to whether these distinct hominin species found each other visually or physically appealing does not require us to rely on theoretical guesswork or incomplete fossil records. We have the absolute, irrefutable proof of their mutual attraction permanently coded into the very blueprint of our existence. Thanks to the groundbreaking, Nobel Prize-winning work originating from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, which successfully sequenced the ancient genome back in 2010, we know with absolute certainty that extensive interbreeding occurred. Today, approximately 1 to 2% of the DNA carried by modern human populations living outside of the African continent is a direct inheritance from those Neanderthal ancestors. This incredibly small but enormously significant percentage of genetic material represents far more than just a dry statistical anomaly. It is effectively the ultimate, undeniable biological punchline to the entire complicated debate about ancient beauty. That surviving DNA tells a genuinely fascinating story of intimacy that completely ignored the boundaries of species classification. It proves beyond any reasonable doubt that when Homo sapiens and Neanderthals looked at one another across a frozen prehistoric valley, they did not just see a terrifying, ugly, or alien competitor. They saw something they desired. They successfully recognized those exceptionally fundamental, honest signals of raw strength, enduring resilience, and undeniable survival capability. And they undeniably found those specific traits deeply attractive enough to passionately and intimately engage with one another and successfully produce perfectly viable offspring together. The profound biological drive to connect, reproduce, and find a mate completely overpowered whatever superficial physical differences existed between the two groups. Physical attraction, in its most raw and incredibly powerful evolutionary form, truly proved to be an enormously resilient force, perfectly capable of bridging the tremendous evolutionary gap separating entirely distinct branches of the human family tree. This remarkable and continually enduring genetic legacy completely and forever redefines our basic understanding of prehistoric connection. It forces us to accept that the capacity to appreciate the physical form of another living being was far broader, significantly more adaptable, and infinitely more profound than our narrow modern beauty standards could ever possibly comprehend. Let's also bring up a genuinely fascinating cognitive shift that moves us beyond raw biological instinct, because this is where the conversation regarding physical appeal elevates into something profoundly philosophical. We have established that early hominins were subconsciously scanning each other for deeply programmed evolutionary markers of genetic fitness. But they did not merely remain passive observers in this biological arena. They actively participated in shaping their own visual identity. To understand this monumental leap in human psychology, we must look closely at the remarkable archaeological discoveries unearthed from Blombos Cave in South Africa. Here, researchers found definitive evidence dating back anywhere from 75,000 to 100,000 years ago, long before the invention of written language. They discovered carefully processed red ochre powder and deliberately pierced marine shells utilized as early bodily adornment and cosmetic decoration. This specific physical evidence represents a staggeringly important milestone in our evolutionary journey. The deliberate application of red pigment to the skin or the careful stringing of shells to wear around the neck is absolutely not a requirement for basic physiological survival. You do not need primitive makeup to successfully hunt, forage, or escape a dangerous predator. Instead, these ancient cosmetic artifacts definitively prove the existence of an immensely complex psychological concept, which is personal perception. For an individual to meticulously crush red ochre and intentionally apply it as a form of personal decoration, they must first possess the profound cognitive ability to visualize how they are perceived by the rest of their immediate social group. They must look inward, recognize their own physical form as a completely distinct entity, and simultaneously look outward to anticipate the subjective aesthetic judgments of their peers. This completely reshapes our understanding of prehistoric intelligence. The profound desire to actively enhance individual appearance demonstrates an enormously sophisticated level of abstract thinking. When those early humans utilized that vivid red ochre, they were essentially taking control of their own evolutionary narrative. They were no longer simply relying on the arbitrary genetic lottery of facial symmetry or robust immune systems to securely broadcast their individual worth to potential mates. They were purposefully manipulating the visual signals they sent into the world. This deliberate act of cosmetic embellishment is a powerful testament to their undeniable intellectual capacity. It clearly shows a hominin mind that is not merely reacting to the harsh environmental pressures of the Ice Age, but is actually carving out a dedicated mental space for artistic expression, social signaling, and the deliberate construction of a personal identity. The fundamental impulse to modify our physical appearance, to present a slightly more elevated or striking version of ourselves to the surrounding community, is not some frivolous byproduct of modern civilization. It is an incredibly ancient, deeply ingrained behavioral pattern that stretches back tens of thousands of years into our shared past. These early attempts at beautification highlight a genuinely beautiful vulnerability. It reveals a deeply familiar human longing to be noticed, to be valued, and to consciously participate in the complex social dynamics of attraction. By actively altering their visual aesthetic, they were profoundly declaring their own humanity. They recognized that the physical body was not just a simple vessel for survival, but a dynamic canvas for meaning. This remarkable evolutionary step confirms that true attractiveness eventually transcended pure biology. It undeniably became a highly intentional art form, When we apply cosmetics today, we are directly mirroring the exact same profound intellectual awakening that occurred in those ancient caves. We are celebrating a profoundly rich cognitive heritage where humanity first discovered the enormous power of deliberate social presentation. Let's finally step back and look at the entire picture we have meticulously pieced together over the course of this deep dive. We began by confronting the startling physical reality of those forensic facial reconstructions, completely shattering the persistent, cartoonish illusion that our distant ancestors were simply lumbering beasts. Beneath the meticulously reconstructed soft tissue, we discovered faces that were profoundly familiar, governed by the exact same strict biological algorithms that quietly dictate our own modern desires today. We realized that the undeniable allure of a highly symmetrical face is absolutely not an arbitrary cultural invention, but a tremendously powerful, ancient honest signal broadcasting vital genetic health and extraordinary survival capability. That raw, deeply programmed biological magnetism proved to be genuinely astonishing in its ultimate reach. It was an evolutionary force so overwhelmingly potent that it completely ignored the seemingly insurmountable physical barriers separating entirely distinct hominin branches. The undeniable presence of Neanderthal DNA seamlessly woven into our own modern genome serves as the ultimate, profoundly intimate proof that prehistoric physical attraction was absolutely not constrained by rigid scientific classifications. They looked across the vast, unforgiving prehistoric landscape and undeniably found each other beautiful enough to completely bridge the immense evolutionary divide. But perhaps the most genuinely fascinating realization is that they did not just passively experience this raw biological attraction. They actively recognized it, cognitively grasped its enormous social power, and deliberately chose to participate in it. When they began carefully processing vivid pigments and meticulously stringing together tiny marine shells, they successfully elevated the concept of physical appeal from a basic, unconscious survival instinct into a highly deliberate, profoundly meaningful expression of personal identity. So, when we ask if ancient humans were actually attractive, the definitive answer is a deeply layered, wonderfully complex yes. They were remarkably attractive because they literally defined the very biological parameters of attraction that we still unconsciously obey today. But infinitely more importantly, they were attractive because they possessed the profound psychological capacity to desire beauty, to actively cultivate it, and to fully recognize the inherent value of being seen by others. This shared, unbroken pursuit of aesthetic connection completely dissolves the staggering chronological distance between us and them. It beautifully unites the endless, overwhelmingly complicated tapestry of human history. It directly connects our modern, highly digital reality, where we endlessly curate our digital profiles and continuously obsess over fleeting fashion trends, all the way back to a profoundly quiet, deeply intimate moment in the prehistoric world. It connects us all the way back to whichever ancient person first picked up a vivid piece of crushed red ochre, gently applied that striking pigment to their own skin, looked down at their own reflection in a pool of completely still water, and decided that they simply wanted to look just a little bit better.